Clearly, a major focus of Mr. Sunak's first budget yesterday was the economic response to the outbreak of coronavirus, but there were also some very large, eye-catching announcements on investment, and lurking more in the background, some important announcements on the government's plan for spending on public services. The big thing, in my opinion, is that the Chancellor chose to set his overall spending review envelope, which is the total pot of money available for him to allocate between departments and public services later in the year. He said that the spending review will conclude in the summer, in July, we're told, rather than later in the year alongside the autumn budget. So for those of you who are fans of fiscal events and IFS analysis of those events, you'll get 3 this year rather than usual 2. Mr. Sunak said that resource or day-to-day budgets will be set for the 3 years up to 2023-24. Capital budgets will be set for a further year up to 24-25. And other spending, most notably spending on social security, is not within the scope of the spending review. And of course, we've had these big promises on investment, some very large numbers floating around. I'll try and make sense of those later on too. The big picture, I think as Paul touched on in his opening remarks, is that the size of the state is now set to increase, and it's set now to stabilize after 2022 at a level higher than we had prior to the crisis, and higher than we had at any point over the course of the 1980s, late 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s. So I'm going to show you here government spending as a share of the economy. You can see now in the final few years it's set to rise and flatten off at about 40.8% of national income. And you can see there that is higher than we were prior to the crisis. In real terms, government spending marches on. It's been increasing steadily over the last 70 years, then was broadly flat from 2010. Over that period, we've had big increases in spending on health, on pensions, for example, offset by reductions in spending on things like debt interest and a range of public services. Over the next 5 years, it's now set to increase. Within his announcement on the spending review envelope, the Chancellor announced that day-to-day spending on public services, so resource budgets, will grow by 2.8% per year over the next spending review period. To give that some context, I'm going to show you here growth in every previous spending review. So 2.8% per year is more generous than Gordon Brown was in his first and his last spending review, less generous than he was in his middle 3. George Osborne, as Chancellor, implemented real terms cuts to departments' day-to-day budgets, and 4.1% was the announcement in last year's September spending round. There's been some talk that this is what a Labour Chancellor might have done. It might look similar in scale to some of the increases we saw in the 2000s under New Labour, but it is certainly not what Mr. McDonnell would have done had he implemented his manifesto. Their manifesto suggested real terms increases of in the line of 7% per year for departments' day-to-day budgets, so that really is an order of magnitude different to what we heard yesterday from Mr. Sunak. But within that 2.8%, the plans are front-loaded, with spending growth this year, next year, and the year after greater than spending in the final 2 years of the forecast period. And you might be suspicious that when push comes to shove, the Chancellor will top up his spending plans for later years rather than make tough choices over allocations between competing public services. Taking the government figures at face value, day-to-day spending on public services is set to increase now and to be almost 10% higher by 2025 than it was in 2010. If we put that in per person terms to account for the growth of the population, it's set to be almost exactly the same in 24-25 as it was in 2009-10. So we'll be back where we were before the era of austerity. Now, of course, some areas have done better than others. We know that the health service, for example, has been repeatedly protected and prioritised and offered real terms increases. So if we strip out health, real terms spending will be 7% lower in 2025 than it was 15 years previously, and in per person terms, 14% lower. However, we don't want to just take the government's numbers at face value, and the raw figures do not tell the full story. That's an incomplete picture. And the big reason for that is because the nominal or the cash total for day-to-day spending in 23-24 is partly funded by this 11.3 billion of direct savings from contributions to the EU that we no longer will have to make as a non-member state. And we expect that had we remained within the European Union, the EU would have undertaken between 7 or 8 billion or so of spending either on our behalf in the UK, on things like farm subsidies, or on regional development funds, or on our behalf elsewhere, The big one of those being EU spending on aid that counts toward meeting the UK's 0.7% of GDP target. So if the government replaced all of that spending, as we don't know it's going to spend pound for pound exactly what the EU would have done, but it seems pretty clear that on aggregate they'll spend a similar amount, that would come out of the settlement for departments. So approximately 7 or 8 billion of that spending in 23-24 won't in fact be new money for departments to spend on the usual set of public services. It will in fact be replacing spending that used to be done by the European Union. So including it will overstate somewhat the generosity of the settlement. And there's also a change included from 2019-20 onwards. It includes a change relating to the discount rate used for employer pension contributions, which pushes up departmental spending on paper by about 5.5 billion, but again, including that, overstates the quote-unquote true increase. So what we're going to do is adjust for these factors to obtain a more consistent measure of how spending's changed over time. Those grey lines are the raw, unadjusted figures that I showed you earlier. Once we adjust for those things, real term spending on public services will be 5% higher by the end of the period than it was at the start, versus 9%. It won't, in fact, reach its 2010 level in per person terms. It will still be 4% lower than it was in 2009-10. Once we strip out health, real term spending is set to be 12% lower than it was 15 years earlier, and in per person terms, close to a fifth lower, so 19% lower in 24-25 than it was in 2009-10. So that's a broad set of departments that will have spending nowhere near where they were in 2010. And if you told them in 2010 that's where spending would be, it would have been quite remarkable to see a period of such sustained spending constraint. And the impact of that is that rather than 2.8% a year growth in real terms departmental spending, we think it's more like 2.1%. So again, somewhere in the region of the lower bound of Gordon Brown's premiership, nowhere near the 7% promised by John McDonnell last year. What does that mean for public services and for spending departments? Well, between this year and next year, so the period covered by last year's spending round, the total raw increase, if you like, is about £14 billion in real terms in today's prices. About 3 billion of that is just replacing EU farm subsidies, so the remaining amount is about 11 billion. There's more money for the NHS and schools in England, but that leaves a healthy 5 billion for everything else. So no department is facing a real terms cut to its budget between this year and next. After that, the picture is slightly different. So again, the raw increase, about 25 billion, is a slight overstatement. Once you take off the 4 billion or so of replacing other EU funding, you're left with about 21. The NHS settlement that covers 5 years up to that end of that period will give about 12 billion more for NHS England. Schools will get more money. The government will spend more money to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as a result of the Barnett formula, and there'll be more money to continue to meet our promises on defence and overseas aid. And what that means is there'll be roughly, this is an estimate, about 3 billion left for everything else. So those areas won't on average be facing real terms cuts based on these estimates, but they will be facing quite tight settlements. And it's worth bearing in mind that that blue block there includes things like the police, it includes local government and social care, and it includes departments that are likely to face considerable increases in their responsibilities once we leave the EU for good. Like HMRC might be running new customs arrangements, the Home Office might be running a new immigration scheme, and those things are likely to require increased resources. So what does that leave us with? So we know that he announced 2.8% annual increases, but much of that will just be to cover new post-Brexit responsibilities and replacing EU funding in the UK. So the settlement is in fact less generous than it seems, and we estimate that it's more like 2.1% on a like-for-like basis. And that means that over the next spending review period, areas outside of those usual suspects, NHS and schools, defence and aid, will be facing tight settlements. If the Chancellor does find additional money for some of his priority areas or make additional money available for new post-Brexit responsibilities, that could mean some cuts for other areas remain within the realm of possibility. Of course, he could top up his plans. Previous Chancellors have chosen to do that again and again. He's reviewing his fiscal rules this year. He might decide he wants to spend more on public services, but that would mean some combination of higher taxes or higher borrowing. So now turn to investment spending. There have been some very big numbers doing the rounds in the last few days. I think the most meaningful way to think about the government's investment plans is as a percent of national income. So I'm going to show you here public sector net investment as a percent of GDP. You can see there the dotted line shows it's set to increase sharply in the next few years, close to 3% of national income. The government's fiscal rules set a ceiling of 3%. It's not allowed to exceed 3%, and the spending path has been chosen so that they stay just within that ceiling. And that means that over the next 5 years, investment spending will average 2.9% of national income, more than double the average for the last 40 years of 1.4%. So this really is an ambitious, sizable increase in planned investment. It will increase investment to levels we haven't seen, certainly not sustained for any period in the last 40 years, and we shouldn't understate the scale of that ambition from the government. Not all investment spending is done by departments, but a big chunk of it is. This is your capital budgets that pay for new hospitals, they pay for new prisons, they pay for new schools, and so on. And the Chancellor also outlined an envelope for that spending for the coming years. So this is for the 4 years between 2021 and 24-25. I'm again going to show you growth by spending review. And you can see that 5.2%, so the Chancellor's planned growth rate, is on the lower end of what we saw under New Labour. Worth bearing in mind, though, that in the early years of New Labour, they were increasing from a very low base. Excuse me. You can see that George Osborne, as Chancellor, implemented quite large cuts to departmental capital budgets. But now the capital budgets for departments will be set to increase steadily in real terms. The challenge for the government will be delivering investment on the scale that it desires. So it's one thing to say you're going to increase departments' capital spending by 5% a year. It's another thing to actually do so. And the OBR assume that 8% of all capital budgets won't actually be spent at all. They assume that 20% of new announcements won't be spent. And so once you take that underspend into account, departmental capital spending will actually only grow by 3.3% per year in the OBR's view, rather than the planned 5.2. And you might think that any underspending might be exacerbated by the fact that, again, the government has chosen to front-load its plans. So we're going to see 13% growth in the first year, and then 1.4% in the fourth and final year. And front-loading, trying to get the spending out the door extremely quickly, risks higher levels of underspend. And there are some quite sizable challenges the government will have to think carefully about how to overcome. There's been persistent over-optimism on timelines for big investment projects. Very rarely do these things get delivered on budget and on time. You might worry about a lack of sufficient civil service expertise around project delivery and shortages of suitably skilled workers in the construction sector who can actually deliver and build these projects that the government likes to announce. So we'll have to think carefully about how to address those challenges in order to deliver. Apologies to anyone who came to our event 2 weeks ago, but I do think this chart deserves wheeling out for a second time. The grey lines here show planned investment spending over the 90s. The green line shows what actually happened. The government undershot its plans of the 2000s. Spending was planned to increase. The red line shows it increased by less than planned. After 2010, spending was planned to be cut back, and the government cut by more than it said. And the takeaway really is that the government has, as far back as these records go, consistently tended to undershoot on its plans. And there's no real reason to think that this time is different, but I would love to be proved wrong. On levelling up, the Chancellor announced a review of the rules that govern project appraisal and decide which projects receive funding. By placing explicitly greater weight on regional equity or regional development, he could rebalance investment spending away from London and the South East. Transport investment per head in London, for example, is about 2.5 times the average in the rest of the country. But we shouldn't expect, even if they do review these rules, those regional differences to disappear entirely. And that's in part because even if you do tweak the rules a bit, the financial returns to investment are still likely to appear greater in those highly productive, densely populated areas like London. And in any case, any levelling up agenda needs to be about more than just investment. Investment is not panacea. These are complex, deep-rooted regional disparities with lots of multiple causes. They'll take time, effort, and careful policy to address, and we shouldn't expect any silver bullets. So some final thoughts. First of all, the Chancellor's spending review envelope is generous as compared to the period since 2010, but it's less generous than it appears at first glance. Part of the funding is required just to increase or replace spending on EU programs. Some areas, as a result, are likely to face tight settlements, and cuts for some areas remain well within the realms of possibility. Setting the overall spending envelope ceiling, so a cash ceiling in advance, is a useful negotiating tool for the Treasury as they enter negotiations with departments and try and keep a lid on spending pressures. But what undermines that is the fact that Chancellors have continually reopened that envelope and topped up spending. And given the degree to which plans are front-loaded in yesterday's budget, we might expect that to be a concern 2 or 3 years down the line. And finally, I want to reiterate again that the government's ambition on investment spending is grand and it's striking, but actually delivering on that investment, both in terms of its scale and delivering it to certain parts of the country, will be, I think, the defining challenge for this government. Thank you very much.